Your savings account shows the same number, but the number is lying. Every month, while you sleep, while you work, while you plan for retirement, something is taking from you. Not a thief, not a tax. Something quieter, something legal, something designed. I spent 6 years watching markets from behind a desk at a mid-size investment firm, tracking debt ratios and running projections. Not once did anyone at the firm mention what I am about to show you. The most dangerous economic weapon in America operates without legislation, without a vote, without a single headline. It runs every single day, in every savings account and retirement fund, transferring wealth from those who save to those who create. This weapon does not look like a weapon because it looks like stability. You check your bank account and see the same number as last month, maybe a few dollars higher from interest. You feel safe and responsible, but while that number sits unchanged, prices are climbing and the value of each dollar is falling. The gap between what you have and what you need grows wider every year. It happens so slowly, you only notice when you look back over a decade. When was the last time you calculated what your savings could actually buy? This is not bad luck or a temporary phase caused by supply chains or oil prices. This is a structural feature of the monetary system you were born into, designed before you opened your first bank account. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was established to stabilize American banking, and that same year, the dollar began its quiet decline. Since 1913, the dollar has lost approximately 96% of its purchasing power according to the Federal Reserve's own inflation data. A dollar your great-grandmother saved would buy less than 4 cents worth of goods today. The number on the paper did not change, but the value behind it evaporated so slowly that no single generation felt the full weight of the loss. I remember the afternoon I first ran the real numbers. 2 spreadsheets open on dual monitors at my desk. One showed my projected retirement balance in dollars, clean columns, rising line, a comfortable future on paper. The other screen adjusted that balance for historical inflation rates stretching back 40 years. I watched my purchasing power collapse by 40%, while the dollar amount stayed exactly the same. The national debt has now surpassed $34 trillion, and that number is not an accident or a failure of policy. Every dollar the Federal Reserve creates dilutes the value of every dollar already saved. This is not a theory, but basic arithmetic. When the money supply expanded by roughly 40% between 2020 and 2021, the wealth sitting in cash and savings accounts did not grow. The digits stayed the same, but the purchasing power behind those digits shrank in real time. Do you know how much purchasing power you lost last year while your balance stayed flat? The average savings account in America yields around 0.5% interest, while official inflation runs between 3 and 8%, depending on the year. The gap between what your money earns and what it loses is not a rounding error, but a wealth transfer mechanism that compounds monthly. Every month, your account balance shows stability, while the math underneath shows continuous loss. Here is what took me years to understand at the firm, and even longer to accept after I left. The Federal Reserve does not accidentally create inflation, but deliberately targets it at 2% per year as official policy. Your savings are designed to lose purchasing power annually, and that is not a side effect, but the stated intention. The system is not broken because it is working exactly as designed. I used to believe that saving money was the responsible path. I believed a growing balance meant a secure future. I trusted the number on my screen because I trusted the system that generated it. But I was measuring the wrong thing. I was counting dollars when I should have been counting purchasing power. The moment I made that switch, everything I thought I knew collapsed. If your money is sitting safely in a bank, why does it feel like you are falling further behind? Look at your bank statement tonight and consider what that number actually represents. That number is not your wealth, but a symbol being quietly redefined every month by the monetary system itself. The silent collapse is not coming because it is already here. It has been running for over a century. This weapon has a name, a mechanism, and a history stretching across every empire that tried to spend more than it earned. And I will show you exactly how it works. The mechanism has a name that most Americans have never heard. It is called the Cantillon effect, named after an 18th century economist who noticed something that central bankers still do not admit publicly. When new money enters an economy, it does not arrive everywhere at once. It flows through specific channels, enriching those closest to the source before prices rise for everyone else. Here is how the silent weapon actually works. The Federal Reserve creates new dollars through a process that sounds technical but operates simply. They purchase treasury bonds or mortgage securities from large financial institutions, and in exchange, those institutions receive freshly created reserves. The money did not exist before the transaction. After the transaction, it does. No mines were dug, and no goods were produced. Numbers changed on a digital ledger, and purchasing power shifted. The banks and financial institutions that receive this new money first can spend it or lend it at current prices. They buy assets, make loans, and expand their holdings before the broader economy feels any effect. By the time the new dollars trickle down to wages and small business revenues, prices have already risen. The last to receive the new money pay the highest prices. That sequence is not random but structural. Have you ever wondered why prices keep rising even when officials say inflation is under control? I found the clearest picture of this mechanism in 2020. The Federal Reserve balance sheet had grown from approximately $900 billion in 2008 to over $4 trillion by 2020. Then the pandemic response began, and within 2 years, that balance sheet peaked above $8 trillion. The money supply, measured by M2, expanded by roughly 40%. That expansion had to go somewhere, and I traced where it went. The first wave of new money flowed into financial assets. Stock prices surged, while unemployment lines stretched around city blocks. Real estate prices climbed, while families struggled to pay rent. The disconnect between Wall Street and Main Street was not a paradox, but a direct consequence of how money enters the system. Those with assets saw their net worth climb. Those paid in wages watched their paychecks buy less each month. I stood at a whiteboard in my office one evening sketching the distribution curve. Money creation at the top, flowing downward through banks to corporations to investors to contractors to wages. At each level, prices adjusted before the next level received the funds. The slope was not steep but gradual, invisible unless you mapped it. I stepped back and saw the shape for what it was, a funnel pointing at the same people every time. If the government can create money, why do they still need to collect taxes from you? The answer reveals the second layer of the mechanism. Taxes do not primarily fund government spending because the Federal Reserve can create whatever money Congress authorizes. Taxes serve a different function. They create demand for the currency itself and drain purchasing power from the private economy to make room for government spending without runaway inflation. You pay taxes not to fund the budget, but to legitimize the currency and absorb some of the inflation that money creation causes. The national debt now exceeds $34 trillion, and annual interest payments are approaching $1 trillion per year. The government cannot repay this debt through taxation alone because the math does not work. Raising taxes high enough to cover the debt would collapse economic activity. Cutting spending enough to balance the budget would trigger recession. The only remaining option is to inflate the debt away by making each dollar worth less over time. This is the trap that cannot be escaped through policy. The debt requires inflation to remain serviceable. Inflation requires money creation. Money creation transfers wealth from savers to those closest to the source. The cycle does not have an exit ramp because the exit ramp would mean default or depression. Neither is politically survivable, so the silent transfer continues. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon stood before cameras and announced a temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility to gold. Foreign governments had been exchanging dollars for American gold reserves at a rate that would have emptied Fort Knox. Nixon closed the gold window to stop the bleeding. He called it temporary, but the window never reopened. That night, the last constraint on dollar creation was removed. Before 1971, the Federal Reserve could not create unlimited dollars because foreign nations could demand gold in exchange. That threat imposed discipline. After 1971, the only limit on money creation was political will, and political will consistently favors spending over restraint. Every administration since Nixon has increased the national debt. Not one has reduced it in absolute terms. The pattern is not partisan, but structural. When new money enters the economy, who gets it first and who gets it last? The answer determines who wins and who loses in every cycle of money creation. Banks receive it first. Large corporations and asset holders receive it second. Contractors and businesses receive it third. Workers and savers receive it last, after prices have already adjusted upward. The gap between first and last is measured in months or years, depending on how the money flows. By the time your wages rise, the raise has already been eaten. I ran the inflation-adjusted model on my own retirement projections after I understood this mechanism. The dollar amounts looked fine. The purchasing power curve told a different story. Every year I stayed in the market. I needed higher returns just to maintain the same real value. I was running to stay in place, and the track was tilting against me by design. The numbers that looked like growth were often just inflation wearing a costume. This is not a conspiracy, because conspiracies require secrecy. The Federal Reserve publishes its balance sheet. The Treasury publishes the debt. The Bureau of Labor Statistics publishes inflation data. Every piece of this mechanism is documented in public records. The weapon is not hidden, but simply unexamined. It operates in the open, because most people never connect the pieces. They see prices rising and blame corporations or supply chains or foreign events. They rarely look at the money supply itself. The mechanism I have shown you is not new. It has operated in every empire that spent more than it produced. Rome debased its currency over centuries. Britain inflated its way out of war debts until the pound lost its reserve status. The pattern repeats because the incentives never change. Governments need to spend more than they collect, and currency debasement is the quietest way to close the gap. The question is not whether America is different, but where we are in the cycle. And that is where history becomes a mirror. The mirror shows the same reflection across 5 centuries. Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, France, Britain, and now the United States. 6 reserve currencies in the modern era, each one dominant in its time, each one certain of its permanence, each one following the same sequence toward the same destination. The pattern begins with productivity. A nation produces more than it consumes and exports the difference. Trading partners accumulate its currency as reserves because that currency can buy real goods. The currency gains trust, not through decree, but through economic output. This is the foundation phase, and it can last generations. The second phase is expansion. Military reach extends to protect trade routes and secure resources. The cost of empire grows faster than the economy beneath it. Spending exceeds production, but the currency remains strong because global demand absorbs the excess. Deficits accumulate quietly while confidence remains high. Why would the United States be different from every empire that came before? The third phase is debt. The empire borrows against its reserve status. Foreign creditors accept the debt because the currency still functions as the global standard. Interest payments grow as a share of revenue. The empire must choose between cutting spending, raising taxes, or inflating the currency. History shows which choice every empire makes. The fourth phase is debasement. The currency loses purchasing power as the money supply expands to service the debt. Prices rise domestically while trading partners begin to diversify their reserves. Trust erodes slowly at first, then accelerates as alternatives emerge. The empire prints more to maintain spending, which accelerates the erosion. The spiral feeds itself. Rome provides the earliest documented case. The silver denarius held stable value for centuries during the Republic and early Empire. Soldiers were paid in denarii, and the coin circulated across 3 continents. Then the costs of expansion exceeded the silver supply. Emperor Nero reduced the silver content from 95% to 93% in 64 AD, a small adjustment that set the precedent. Over the next 2 centuries, successive emperors continued the debasement. By the reign of Diocletian, around 300 AD, the denarius contained less than 5% silver. Prices had risen by a factor of 50 or more. Soldiers demanded payment in goods rather than coins. The monetary system that built the empire could no longer sustain it. Rome did not fall in a day, but inflated itself into fragmentation over generations. Spain dominated global trade after conquering the Americas. Silver flowed from Potosi and Mexican mines into Spanish coffers. The real became the first true global reserve currency. But Spain spent its wealth on European wars and imperial administration faster than the mines could produce. Prices doubled, then doubled again. By 1600, Spanish inflation had crippled domestic industry. The empire that held more silver than any nation in history inflated itself into decline. The Dutch guilder rose as Spain fell. Amsterdam became the financial center of Europe. The Dutch East India Company operated as the first multinational corporation. The guilder held value because Dutch merchants produced and traded more than they consumed. Then came the wars with England and France. Military spending drained the treasury. The central bank expanded credit to fund the state. By the late 1700s, the guilder had lost its dominance to the rising British pound. If history repeats this pattern with precision, where are we in the cycle? Britain built the largest empire in human history, and the pound sterling became the dominant reserve currency by the mid-1800s. At its peak, over 60% of global trade was denominated in pounds. British industry produced goods that the world needed, and British banks financed global commerce. The system seemed permanent. Two world wars ended British dominance. The cost of defeating Germany twice exceeded British productive capacity. Debt accumulated faster than the economy could service it. The United States emerged as the creditor, and power followed the debt. At Bretton Woods in 1944, delegates from 44 nations gathered at a resort in New Hampshire to design the post-war monetary system. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency. Britain had followed the pattern exactly. The dollar was anchored to gold at $35 per ounce under Bretton Woods. Other currencies were pegged to the dollar. This system worked as long as American gold reserves could back the dollars held abroad. By the 1960s, that math was failing. Foreign dollar holdings exceeded American gold reserves. The system required either deflation or devaluation. Nixon chose devaluation in 1971 and closed the gold window permanently. The dollar share of global reserves peaked near 70% in the early 2000s. Today, that share has declined to approximately 58%, according to International Monetary Fund data. The decline is gradual, measured in fractions of a percentage point per year. But the direction has not reversed in 2 decades. Central banks in China, Russia, and the Middle East are accumulating gold and alternative currencies. The diversification is quiet but measurable. What evidence would convince you that the dollar will remain the global reserve currency? The average lifespan of reserve currency status is approximately 80 to 100 years, based on historical patterns. The dollar became the primary reserve currency in 1944. 80 years have now passed. This does not mean collapse arrives on a specific date. It means the window of historical precedent is closing. Every decade that passes without structural reform increases the probability that the pattern will complete. The mechanism anchor across all these cases is identical. Every empire inflates to fund expansion. Inflation transfers wealth from savers to the state and its connected institutions. The transfer continues until inflation exceeds productive capacity. At that point, trading partners lose confidence and seek alternatives. The transition is never instant, but always directional. Once it begins, no empire has reversed it. The Bretton Woods delegates in 1944 believed they were building a permanent system. British officials at the table had believed the same about the pound 50 years earlier. Spanish kings believed their silver would last forever. Roman emperors believed the denarius would never fail. Belief does not alter arithmetic. The math eventually forces the outcome regardless of intention. The United States holds one advantage no previous empire possessed. The dollar is still required for oil purchases and global trade settlement. This creates artificial demand that sustains the currency beyond what domestic economics would support. But this advantage is eroding. China settles oil trades in yuan. Russia accepts rubles and rupees. The BRICS nations are discussing alternative settlement systems. Each small shift reduces the structural demand that props up the dollar. The pattern does not predict a specific date. It reveals a direction that has not changed in 5 centuries. Every reserve currency follows the same arc from productivity to expansion to debt to debasement. The United States has completed the first 3 phases. The 4th phase is not a future event, but a present condition. The only question is pace, and pace is accelerating. The endgame is not approaching from the horizon. It is already visible in the data, and the data does not lie. The data does not lie, but it does require translation. Numbers on a government website mean nothing until you measure them against your own life. So let me translate what the pattern means for anyone holding dollars in a savings account, a retirement fund, or a pension plan. The endgame is not a future catastrophe. It is a present condition that compounds daily. Real median household income in the United States has stagnated since approximately the mid-1970s when adjusted for inflation. The paychecks got larger in nominal terms. The purchasing power behind those paychecks flatlined for 50 years. Two incomes became necessary where one had been sufficient. Credit cards filled the gap between wages and cost of living. Debt replaced income growth as the engine of middle-class consumption. Consider what housing reveals about the transfer. In 1975, the average American home cost approximately $40,000. Today, that number exceeds $400,000, a tenfold increase in 5 decades. But median income did not increase tenfold. The home price to median income ratio sat around 3 to 1 in 1970. Today, it exceeds 7 to 1 in most major markets. The same house requires more than twice as many years of labor to purchase. That gap is the silent weapon measured in bricks and mortgages. If your savings will buy less every year, how many working years are you actually losing to the gap? The math is not abstract. A worker saving diligently in 1975 could purchase a median home with 5 years of median income dedicated entirely to the purchase. A worker today needs over 14 years of median income for the same home. The extra 9 years did not disappear. They were transferred. The silent weapon moved nearly a decade of labor value from savers to asset holders. That transfer happened while both workers believed they were making progress. Retirement projections tell the same story when measured honestly. The Social Security Trust Fund is projected to face depletion between 2033 and 2035, according to the program's own trustees. Benefits may be reduced by roughly 20% at that point, unless Congress acts. But Congress acting means either raising taxes, cutting benefits, or printing money to fill the gap. Two of those options take from workers directly. The third option takes through inflation. Every path leads to the same destination through different doors. I stopped measuring my savings in dollars 2 years before I left the firm. The shift happened slowly. I started tracking purchasing power instead of account balances, a different spreadsheet with different inputs, same data, but different conclusions. The number that looked like growth was often just inflation plus a small margin. Real returns after inflation and taxes often approached zero. Some years they went negative while my balance climbed. When the next crisis arrives, will the response be to print more or let the system fail? History answers that question with perfect consistency. The 2008 financial crisis produced quantitative easing and trillions in new money creation. The 2020 pandemic produced even larger stimulus and the fastest money supply expansion in modern American history. Each crisis was met with the same tool. Each application of the tool accelerated the wealth transfer from savers to asset holders. The playbook does not change because the alternatives are politically impossible. A controlled demolition looks different from an explosion. The dollar is not collapsing in the dramatic sense that headlines would capture. It is deflating steadily, predictably, by design. The Federal Reserve targets 2% inflation as explicit policy. 2% per year compounds to 22% over a decade. Your savings must grow by 22% just to maintain the same purchasing power over 10 years. Anything less is a loss that looks like a gain. The trap has no exit that avoids pain. If the Federal Reserve stops creating money, interest rates rise, and the government cannot service $34 trillion in debt without consuming the entire budget. If they continue creating money, inflation transfers wealth from savers to debtors. Default is politically unthinkable. Austerity is politically impossible. The only remaining option is gradual inflation that stays below the threshold of public outrage. The silent weapon is silent precisely because it operates below the pain threshold of any single year. I sat at my kitchen table the week after I left the firm. Laptop closed, coffee cold. I was not running models anymore. I was just sitting with what the models had shown me. The system is not broken. The system is functioning exactly as designed. It requires your purchasing power to depreciate so the debt can be serviced without explicit default. This is not corruption. This is function. If this pattern is visible to anyone who looks at the data, why do so few people see it? The answer is uncomfortable. Seeing the pattern requires abandoning a belief that feels like safety. The belief that saving money in dollars is responsible. The belief that a growing balance means a secure future. The belief that the system rewards patience and punishes speculation. These beliefs were useful once. They are dangerous now because they prevent accurate perception of where value is flowing. A retiree today, holding a fixed pension, watches grocery prices climb while their check stays flat. They did everything right by the old rules. They saved and worked and waited. The rules changed beneath them without announcement. The silent weapon does not discriminate by effort or intention. It transfers from those holding depreciating currency to those holding appreciating assets. The transfer is mechanical, not moral. The most dangerous economic weapon does not destroy wealth instantly. It transfers wealth slowly, legally, and silently. And the moment you understand this, you can never see your savings account the same way again. The collapse is not coming. It is here. Quiet, structural, designed. Every dollar you save, every year you wait, the silent weapon keeps working. Not against you, through you,